Hi, everyone. I wanted to take some time to go over the PowerPoint on Chapter 6 with you. Pull that up here. Right. So what we have here in Chapter 6 is all about recognizing, analyzing, and constructing arguments, which is a huge component of critical thinking. It's one of the most common ways that we use our critical thinking skills is to look at other people's arguments and construct our own arguments. Now, you might be thinking that you don't personally feel like that's what a significant portion of your day consists of is argument, but that might be because we have a very skewed perception of what argument actually is. So that's why we start with recognizing arguments, right? Because we don't mean argument in terms of like angry shouting matches or even debating. When we talk about argument, it's in terms of using reason and evidence to support a claim or a conclusion. And that doesn't have to necessarily be big drawn out screaming matches. In fact, that's an argument, I suppose, but it's not constructing an argument. It's not quite the same thing. We are presented with arguments and we construct our own arguments in that strict term of simply using reason and evidence to support a claim or a conclusion all the time. Arguments are a form of inquiry. They provide us with reasons to accept or reject a particular position so that we can make up our own mind about that issue. And again, it doesn't have to be a big, huge, hot topic issue, even just small issues in our daily lives. We are taking in evidence and explanations, and we're using reasoning skills to come up with our own point of view so that we can then perhaps make a decision or, take a course of action, right? So that's what we mean by argument. It's simply, the process in which we support a claim. It's not about shouting matches, or even, in a more formal setting, it's not even about like a debate necessarily. At least not when we think of a debate. When I think of debate, I think of like a debate team, where you have like 3 people from one school here and 3 people from another school over at the other podium, and each side takes turns, and at the end, one team is declared the winner. That even a debate is still not quite what we mean when we simply talk about argument in its sort of purest form, right? But we are constantly bombarded with arguments about issues. The internet, television, newspapers, advertisers, politicians, and then even just in our everyday lives. And as citizens in a democracy, we need to develop the skills to critically analyze arguments and to make our own informed decisions that are based on our evaluations of those arguments. And then by honing those skills to be, better participants in a democracy, we're also sharpening those skills to help us make better decisions in our personal lives. It's a crucial component. So we had said that argument is taking in all of the evidence and explanations and reasoning through them to either accept or reject a particular point of view and coming up with our own on an issue. So what is an issue? Well, arguments help us to analyze issues and to decide whether or not the position on that issue is reasonable or unreasonable. So an issue is sort of a very ill or vaguely defined complex set of problems, typically involving some sort of controversy or even just some sort of uncertainty. So the issue is sort of like the broader umbrella, right? And one problem that a lot of us have, especially when we are writing an argument or discussing an argument or an issue, is that we fail to define the issue clearly. We sort of stay up here in that umbrella part, when what we should be doing is trying to pick out more specific things that fall under the umbrella, right? And when we stay up in that the top part of the umbrella, we don't really go into anything in depth. So the discussion about that issue, that broad issue, often remains very unfocused. It probably jumps around from one idea to the next, none of which are really ever developed fully. And it's because the issue that we started with is really just a broad topic with several different focused issues that each need to be discussed in depth. So it's important that we know what the issue is that we want to focus on, or that someone else is focusing on, before we fully engage, right? So how do you identify an issue? The first thing is that it requires asking the right questions, because we have to sort of ask the right questions to get to the heart of the issue. It also requires very good communication skills. So in our personal relationships, open communication can help us resolve issues, problems, and it can help get to a shared understanding of the real issue. So for instance, if you're in a romantic relationship and one person is feeling like, they aren't receiving the attention they need, the attention they deserve, or maybe they feel like the other person is upset with them, whatever the case may be, if they don't clearly communicate with their partner, the partner is either not going to understand that they're upset at all, or they're going to assume they're upset for something else, some other reason, or they could get defensive. But it's because the person who is feeling neglected isn't clearly communicating the exact issue, right? There's sometimes where we don't really have the opportunity to discuss and clarify and openly communicate to get to the heart of the issue. For instance, when you're reading something or hearing a speech, that's being recorded or televised or live streamed or something, we don't necessarily get to ask questions and openly communicate to get to the heart of the issue. In that case, you have to sort of rely on context clues, looking at titles, looking at what is said in the introduction, looking at, sections of the argument or sections of the speech, whatever the case may be, to try to figure out what the issue is that's being discussed, right? So asking the right questions, we have an example here. So suppose you live with several roommates and you come home from school one day and you find that your wallet is missing because it isn't on your dresser, which you're pretty sure is where you left it. It's not there. What is the issue? Right? We have a problem. What is the issue? Many people will answer that by saying, well, the issue is who stole my wallet. Well, but we don't know that anything has been stolen at this point. All we know is that the wallet isn't where you thought you left it, right? So asking who stole it is making a very big assumption that can't be substantiated yet, right? There are many possible explanations to consider. Did it fall behind the dresser? Maybe you're mistaken and you put it on your wallet at some point during the morning before you left, but you ended up moving it over to your desk and you forgot. Or maybe you put it in your jacket and then decided to wear a different jacket or no jacket at all, right? All you know for sure is that the wallet is not where you think you left it. So the real way to state this issue, and we typically state issues in the form of a question to start with anyway, is what happened to my wallet, right? Remember, one of the good traits of a good critical thinker is to be open-minded. So when we are starting to think about and research or, investigate a topic, an issue, putting it in the form of a question is the first step in allowing you to keep an open mind. But even how the question is stated is important as well. You can see a distinct difference between what happened to my wallet versus who stole my wallet, right? What happened to my wallet gives us such a broad spectrum of possibilities, we can, and it allows us to focus on all of them equally in the beginning. But if you just start with who stole my wallet, then that has given you a very definitive direction that your exploration and investigation are going to go in. And it's ignoring all of these other possibilities over here, which at this point are as equally possible as someone having stolen it. So keeping an open mind and phrasing the issue in an open-minded way in the form of a question helps get you started on the right track, right? How do we recognize an argument? Because it's not always as easy as it seems. So when we start with a position statement rather than an open-ended question that invites us to explore and analyze, we're using rhetoric. So when we say, who stole my wallet, we are venturing into the realm of rhetoric rather than argument. And a lot of people mistake rhetoric for argument. There's a good reason why we make that mistake. But it's probably first important that we understand what rhetoric is and how it is different from argument, right? So rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And it traces all the way back to ancient Greece. I feel like we kind of got it wrong in naming these two ideas. When you hear what rhetoric is, it's going to sound like arguing to you. And when you hear the definition of argument, exploring to get to a truth, then that sounds like what we would call rhetoric, but it's actually the opposite. And I believe the reason why rhetoric is what it is, the definition of it, is because it's so old and traces all the way back to ancient Greece. But rhetoric is the art of persuasion. It is the defense of a particular position, and often without considering opposing evidence. Remember, that's confirmation bias, right? Where we only look for evidence that supports the point of view we already have. Rhetoric does that a lot. So people who are engaging in rhetoric, they sound like they're presenting an argument, but it's not really an argument because they haven't fully investigated the topic. They have not looked at all points of view. They have really only looked to support their own existing point of view. And the goal is to win. This is what debate is. Well, I won't say that all debates don't, involve looking at all points of view, because hopefully they do. Like if it's like truly like a debate team kind of deal, or like a presidential or vice presidential debate, hopefully they have looked at all points of view, if for no other reason than to prepare themselves for what their opposition is going to say. But typically, the goal is to win. And often it is done by really only focusing on evidence that supports that person's existing point of view. But the purpose of argumentation is to discover the truth. So sure, you might be researching an issue and you already have a preconceived point of view, a preconceived notion about that topic. That's that's pretty standard, unless, you know, it's something that you just heard of and you're like, oh, I don't really know what that is. Let me research this topic. And along the way, you form a point of view. But in our world today, most of the time when we're researching a topic and researching an issue, we have already heard about it to some extent. And we probably already have at least a vague point of view on the issue. But when we are engaging in true argument, we're not stuck to that point of view. We are researching every possibility so that we can learn as much as possible, take in as many perspectives as possible, as much evidence as possible, and sift through it and sort of piece together our own unique point of view on that topic. And then we might engage in debate with someone, discussing that issue, hearing their perspective, hearing their point of view. And maybe if they have really good, credible evidence to support their point of view, it might cause you to sort of change or tweak your point of view. And it just keeps going, and we keep evolving, and we keep adding to our knowledge and adjusting our point of view as needed. That's argument. It's just getting to the truth. It is being able to say, this is my point of view, this is my perspective, and this is why. Because I've done all of this research. I have looked at every different point of view that's out there, no matter how different it is from mine. And I have done so with an open mind. And here is the point of view, the perspective that I hold based on all of that. But rhetoric is often, well, let me say that. Once you've done that, and you've done it ethically and responsibly, coming up with that point of view, you could then engage in rhetoric, where you are using the art of persuasion to convince others to see it from your perspective. But you can only do that honestly if you have gone through the steps of argument first. A lot of people skip those steps and they go right to rhetoric, where they have an initial point of view and the only research they do is to confirm that point of view, and then they try to persuade others to agree with them. And that's not right. It's not right to try to persuade someone else to agree with your point of view when you're not even sure what any of the opposing points of view really say. You might think you do, but have you actually researched it? Have you actually taken the time to view those different perspectives with an open mind, to see if maybe there's credible evidence to back up what they say, just like there's credible evidence to back up what you say? If you haven't done that, it's wrong to engage in rhetoric and to try to persuade someone to agree with you. You're not giving them a chance to explore it for themselves. I mean, they could, but in that moment, you're not presenting them with the full picture. So therefore, it's really wrong to try to convince them to agree with you, right? So rhetoric can be used as a component of argument, but only at the end of the process, right? And again, a lot of people skip the process and go straight to rhetoric. So that's when rhetoric becomes a problem, when it is a substitute for unbiased research and logical argumentation. When you skip those steps, you're not giving a valid claim. And rhetoric sort of inundates us in our culture. When people are using rhetoric poorly, unethically, it can deteriorate into very heated and overly emotional fights and disagreements. And then both sides start to engage in resistance. Both sides can start using fallacies rather than logical reasoning. The rhetoric is often a negative side effect of debate and discussion, because we skip the important parts which is the process of argument. So again, argument is what we use to discover the truth, or at least our truth. The purpose of argument is to present good reasons for a particular position, to give good reasons for your perspective, your point of view, and to offer a forum for evaluating the soundness of those reasons. So you've done all the work. You've been a good critical thinker, going through the steps, going through the process of argument, and you come up with your position, your point of view. The whole reason you're going to do that, though, is to then offer that up to other people so they can hear your point of view and they can hear your reasoning and they can give you feedback of some sort, right? It's sort of to double check that, yes, you have a very specific point of view and it is backed up with sound, credible reasoning. Or maybe parts of it aren't, and you need to go back and do a little more research and do a little more evaluating and analyzing and then tweaking your point of view as needed, right? That's what argument is. And we're more likely to move towards truth when all sides of an issue are presented and heard. That it's just the way it is. So let's look at types of arguments, right? So arguments are made up of two or more propositions, one of which is the conclusion, which is supported by the other propositions, the premises. All right, so we've got deductive, and we're gonna, all those terms that I just said in that sentence, we're gonna talk about here in just a minute. So we have two types of arguments. We have deductive arguments, which is, those are arguments that where the conclusion is sort of like, we almost have to accept it as truth because of the way the argument was presented, the form of the argument. The premises sort of provide proof of the conclusion, whereas an inductive argument is where the premises strongly support the conclusion, but don't necessarily prove it. There's still room for question, but the premises, if they're strong, they strongly support the conclusion. We're going to talk about both types of argument this week, but in different videos. So inductive arguments is chapter 7, which will be the next lesson, and then deductive arguments are chapter 8, which is the third lesson this week. So we're going to come back to both of those, right? But let's take a look at those terms that were used in the first part of that slide. So we said that an argument is a set of propositions, right? An argument is made up of two or more propositions. At least, so that there has to be two statements at least. One of the propositions will be a premise. Another proposition will be the conclusion. You can kind of see this little diagram here. We have argument. What is an argument? It is propositions. So we have premise plus premise equals conclusion, or it could just be premise equals conclusion. But there's got to be at least two propositions. One is a premise, one is a conclusion. But you can have an argument that has 5 premises and 1 conclusion, right? So we have an example here. So we have Socrates as a person. All people are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. So our first proposition is a premise. Socrates is a person. Our second proposition is also a premise. All people are mortal. Our third proposition is our conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay, let's take a closer look at propositions and premises. All right, so propositions are statements that express a complete thought. Every statement in an argument is a proposition, the premises and the conclusion. Because a proposition can either be true or false. And if you're not sure whether a statement is a proposition, try putting the phrase, it is true that, blah, 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 or it is false that, blah, 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 at the beginning of the statement. We've got some examples here. So we have this proposition right here, the earth revolves around the sun. So to test whether that's a proposition, we put one of these phrases in front of it. It is true that the earth revolves around the sun. Yes, that is true. So it is a proposition. Or Chris doesn't show me enough affection. It is true that Chris doesn't show me enough affection. Well, we're taking this person's word for it, that, and it could be proven true. Now, if we really wanted to get into the nitty-gritty details, we would need to know what they mean by affection. And, but still, it is a statement that is making a true or false claim. Or cheating on exams is wrong. Put the phrase in front of it. It is true that cheating on exams is wrong. Even people who cheat on exams know it's wrong. So yes, that would be a proposition. It is a true statement. It is true that Toronto is the capital of Canada. Well, that's actually not true. So we would need to say it is false that Toronto is the capital of Canada. If we say it that way, it's a proposition either way. It's just, is it wrong or right? But it's still a proposition because it can be proven true or false, right? One sentence can contain more than one proposition. Okay, so a proposition is not just a sentence. It is an idea, a statement that is either true or false. So we have an example here. Marcos is taking 4 courses this semester and working in his parents' store 20 hours a week. There's 2 complete thoughts in that one single sentence. Both thoughts are propositions. Marcos is taking 4 courses this semester. Marcos is working in his parents' store 20 hours a week. Or our second example, Karen is smart, but not very motivated to do well in school or try to find a job that uses her talents. So we have one proposition, Karen is smart. We have a second one, Karen is not very motivated to do well in school. And 3, Karen is not very motivated to try to find a job that uses her talents. Those are all statements that can be shown to be true or false. They all appear in one single sentence, but it is still 3 separate propositions. All right. Now, one sentence can have multiple propositions at the same time. One single, a sentence might not be a proposition at all. Because remember, a proposition is just an idea that can be proven true or false. So not all sentences are going to function as propositions, because not all sentences are going to contain thoughts that can be proven true or false. But they're not really part of an argument either, right? So we have a directive sentence. Let's go out and celebrate the end of final exams. Telling someone what to do, right? Or giving direction. That is not part of an argument, but it's also not a statement that can be proven true or false either. It's just a directive statement. Or we have expressive statements like, wow, gee, I love you, right? It's not an argument, and it's not necessarily, I guess, that I prove that I love you is true or false, maybe, but that's not, we know that it's an expressive statement. It's not part of an argument, and it's not something that is known to be true or false. It could be a request for information, just a question. What is the capital of Canada? That's not part of an argument. It's, the answer would be a proposition, but the question itself is not. It's just a request for information. None of those examples are making a claim that something is true or false, but propositions do. Propositions contain an idea that can be shown to be true or false. right? So let's take a look. And again, pretty much, if we're dealing with an argument, every statement will be a proposition. When we're dealing in everyday life and we're discussing an issue or engaging in argument, we may have some of those other types of sentences thrown into our conversation, or even when we write an essay, right? We write an argumentative essay. The overall essay is presenting an argument, but not every single sentence will be part of an argument. We will have some directive sentences. We will have some expressive sentences. We will have, questions, right? But when we're looking at just the simple form of an argument, every statement is a proposition, right? Of those propositions, some or all of them will be premises, and at least one of them will be a conclusion. So your premises are the propositions that are giving support. They're providing the reasons to accept the conclusion. So our reasoning goes from premises to conclusion, right? Our premises are our reasons. Good premises are based on fact and experience. The more credible the premises are, the better the argument is likely to be, right? And there are several types of premises, which we're going to look at on the next slide. But first, let's look at the conclusion of an argument. It is the proposition that is being supported or denied based on the premises, right? The conclusion is sometimes referred to as the claim, the viewpoint, the point of view, the position, the stance. It's whatever the argument is trying to prove. That's our conclusion. And a conclusion, even though it, by its very name, indicates that it comes at the end, it comes at the end of the theoretical argument, of course, because you have to go through the reasons to get to the conclusion. But in terms of speaking the argument or writing the argument, the conclusion can appear anywhere, right? It can appear at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end. We'll look at that as well. So let's look at the 4 types of premises. Remember, premises are the reasons. Your reasoning to support the conclusion. We have descriptive premises. These are based on empirical facts. So scientific observation or things that we can experience with our 5 senses as evidence. So Ottawa is the capital of Canada is a descriptive premises because it's based on empirical fact. Like there's no way to question that or debate it. It's an empirical fact. You can look on a map and see it, right? Lisa loves Antonio. That's also scientific observation and something picked up on by our 5 senses. Our emotions, right? We can consider those to be empirical facts, right? Because it's based on our physical experience. We have prescriptive premises. These are value statements that say what should or should not be done. So for example, we should strive for diversity on college campuses, right? We're assuming everyone thinks that that statement is true. Remember, because it's a premise. If it's, it's a premise. It's the support. But it's saying what should be done. So it's prescriptive, right? So if you prescribe something, it's saying you should do this. So we should strive for diversity, or it is wrong to cheat on exam. So prescriptive premises are where value judgments come into play. We also have analogical premises. This is where we're sort of comparing 2 similar events or 2 similar things to help support our conclusion. So, for example, there might be life on Europa because it has an atmosphere that contains oxygen just like the Earth, right? So an analogy, comparing 2 things. Or wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as unto the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. So we have that comparison there. Christ is the head of the church, so therefore the husband should be the head of the family, right? We're using comparisons to help support whatever our conclusion is going to be. Then we have definitional premises, using definitions. So a definition of a key term is one thing that's being used, one reason that's being used to help support the conclusion. So for instance, toy cars are toys that have the same shape and design as real cars, but they do not function to transport people from one place to another. Whatever our conclusion is going to be, it's going to have something to do with cars. And we're using this definition of toy cars to help support that conclusion. Or language is a type of communication that involves a set of arbitrary symbols, whether spoken, written, or nonverbal. So somehow the definition of language is going to help support our conclusion, whatever that might be. 4 types of premises, right? Remember, the premises are our reason, our support for the conclusion. Now, just as not all propositions are premises and not all statements are propositions, there are going to be statements that look like argument but aren't. They're what we call non-arguments, and they come in the form of explanations and conditional statements. And like I said, sometimes we confuse those two things with arguments. So an explanation is a statement about why or how something is the case. A conditional statement is one of those hypothetical, if this happens, then this will happen. But there's no claim or conclusion attached to it. So explanations and conditional statements aren't trying to show that something is true or false. They're just statements. Let's look at these a little closer. Explanations. It is a statement about why or how something is the case. With an explanation, we know that something has occurred. The explanation is going to tell us how or why. So example, the cat yowled because I stepped on her tail. Or, I'm upset because you promised you would meet me at the student union right after class and you never showed up. Both contain explanations. We're not trying to prove anything or convince someone through supporting evidence. We are simply trying to explain why the cat yelled and why we are upset, right? We're not trying to support a conclusion. Now, that doesn't mean that all explanations, have to be taken at face value. They can be faulty. For instance, the dog ate my homework, that's why I can't turn it in. That's an explanation that is that should be met with a lot of skepticism, right? And then it could possibly snowball into some sort of actual argument. But even though the explanation is very lame, it's still not an argument. It is still simply an explanation, right? All right. Conditional statements are the other type of non-argument. It is really easy to mistake these for arguments because, as we will learn in chapters 7 and 8, these types of statements are used in argument, but they're used alongside other actual types of premises. So when taken by itself, a conditional statement is not an argument. So for example, if we say, if Francois comes from Montreal, then she understands French, an if-then statement. That by itself is not an argument. Or if 18-year-olds are emotionally mature enough to go to war, then they should be allowed to drink alcohol. It sounds like an argument, but it's not, because there's nothing else that goes along with those statements. All we're doing is just drawing a conclusion that Francois understands French, or we're just, we're not trying to prove, or support the idea that 18-year-olds should be allowed to drink. We're simply presenting hypothetical if-then statements, which by themselves are not arguments. But if they are joined by another statement that is a premise, then they could be part of an argument. For example, if Francois comes from Montreal, then she understands French. Francois comes from Montreal. Therefore, Francois understands French. Now we are drawing a conclusion. We're saying she understands French. Whereas originally we were just saying if she comes from Montreal, she understands French. But we don't know. Does she come from Montreal? We don't know, right? Now we know. Francois comes from Montreal. All right, there you go. Francois understands French. Now we've made an argument. We have two premises and a conclusion, right? Or if 18-year-olds are emotionally mature enough to go to war, then they should be allowed to drink alcohol. 18-year-olds are not emotionally mature enough to go to war. Therefore, 18-year-olds should not be allowed to drink alcohol. I think we're making the wrong conclusion here. Because if 18-year-olds are not emotionally mature enough to go to war, maybe the conclusion should be 18-year-olds should not be allowed to go to war. But we're dealing with the alcohol issue. And so we took that conditional statement, we attached it to a premise, and now we can draw a conclusion, right? So conditional statements by themselves are not arguments. If that type of statement is paired with a premise, then we can draw a conclusion and we have an argument, right? All right, so we're going to look at sort of breaking down. We're not actually going to diagram in the book. It shows how to physically diagram them. We're still going to break them down and identify those elements of argument that the book does, but I'm just going to do it in a different way that's a little more PowerPoint friendly. But knowing how to identify parts of an argument kind of helps us visualize the whole thing. We can see the propositions. We can see the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So we have to first identify the proposition. Then we're going to look for, and this might seem backwards, we're going to look at all the propositions first, right? Remember, propositions are the true-false statements. Out of those propositions, we are going to then find the conclusion. Once we have found the conclusion, we are then going to identify all of the premises. Remember, the premises are the propositions that support the conclusion, our reasons for the conclusion. All right. So remember, I had said before that the conclusion, even though it sounds like it should always be at the end, when we are writing and speaking arguments, our conclusion can actually come anywhere. It can come at the beginning, the middle, or the end. So we have some examples. So our conclusion coming at the beginning of the argument. Toronto is not the capital of Canada because Canada only has one capital, and that capital is Ottawa. Our conclusion is that Toronto is not the capital of Canada. That's what we're trying to prove, right? And it was the very first proposition in the statement, right? The other two premises are our support. Canada only has one capital. That capital is Ottawa, right? We can have it, the conclusion in the middle of the argument. Ottawa is the capital of Canada, which means Toronto is not the capital of Canada, since Canada only has one capital. So our first premise, Ottawa is the capital of Canada, that's a true-false statement, so that's a proposition, but it's part of our support. It's one of our reasons why. Then we have our conclusion in the middle. The second premise, Canada only has one capital. That's our second reason why. Or we can have it come at the end. Canada has only one capital, which is Ottawa, so Toronto is not the capital of Canada. So we had premise one, premise two, conclusion. So support, support, conclusion. Right? So keep that in mind then, because you don't want to misinterpret someone else's argument because you're looking at the end of it to figure out what their point is or what they're trying to prove. It's possible they told you that in the beginning or somewhere in the middle. So if we're always looking at the end, if we're always looking at the end of an essay or article, or if we're only paying attention to what we hear at the end of a speech, we may miss what it is they're actually trying to prove. Because it can come anywhere, right? So keeping that in mind, again, identifying the parts of an argument, we're going to look first for the proposition, right? So an argument can be contained in one single sentence, right? Where it has the premises and the conclusion all in one sentence, or it can contain several sentences in proposition. So remember, the propositions are true, false statements. Example, I think, therefore I am. I have used brackets to identify the propositions in that argument. I think, I am. Those two statements can be, I can put the phrases, it is true that I think. It is true that I am. I can construct the sentence that way and it sounds logical, then I have propositions. Or what about students who sit in front of a classroom generally earn higher grades. Therefore, you should move up to the front of the class since I know you want to improve your grade point average. So it is true that students who sit in front of a classroom generally earn higher grades. Proposition. It is true that you should move up to the front of the class. Proposition. It is true that I know you want to improve your grade point average. Proposition. Right? So remember, step two then, once we have identified all the propositions, we want to look for the conclusion. First thing you should do is look for what we call conclusion indicators. Those are words like so, therefore, thus, consequently. They indicate that a conclusion is being stated, right? They help us identify the conclusion faster. Not all arguments are going to contain conclusion indicators. So if that's the case, then you just have to ask yourself, what is this person trying to prove or convince me of? What's their point? Your answer to that is probably the conclusion, right? If you're still not sure, you can use the word therefore in front of any of the propositions and see if it makes sense. Once you think you have the conclusion identified, you're going to mark it in some way, or at least note it in some way. Here in this, I am using yellow highlighter to indicate our conclusion indicators, the words that let us know a conclusion is about to be stated. And I'm using blue highlight to indicate what the conclusion actually is. So in our first example, I think, therefore, that's our conclusion indicator, I am. This is what we're trying to prove. We're trying to prove I am, I exist, right? Students who sit in front of a classroom generally earn higher grades. Therefore, yellow, because it's the conclusion indicator, you should move up to the front of the class. That's our conclusion because that's what we're trying to prove, right? Why should you move up to the front of the class? Because students who are in the front typically get higher grades, and I know you are trying to improve your grade point average. Both of those things together say you should move up to the front of the class. both of those had those conclusion indicators, the same one, therefore it's a very popular conclusion indicator. So they were a little easier to figure out, but even without them, we could figure out what the conclusion was. Right? It is just, what is the person trying to prove? Once we have identified all the propositions and the conclusion, including any possible conclusion indicators, we are then going to identify all of the premises. Because remember, the premises are the leftover statements that help support the conclusion, our reasoning behind the conclusion. Why are we identifying the conclusion first and the premises last? Well, my view on that is, again, sometimes it's pretty easy to tell what the conclusion is. Sometimes it's really easy to tell what the person is trying to prove. What matters even more though is their reason. So once we know what the conclusion is, then it's time to look at every single premise that has been included, right? Premises might also have indicators. Words like for, so, because, since, right? So we're going to look for premise indicators and then identify the premises themselves. I am using green to highlight any possible premise indicators, those words that let us know there's a reason being presented. And I'm using just underlining to identify each premise in the argument. So I think, therefore I am. We don't have any premise indicators in this one. It's just I think. That is our first reason, our only reason for our conclusion of I am. Students who sit in front of a classroom generally earn higher grades. That's our first premise, our first reason why this person should move to the front of the class. And then I know you want to improve your grade point average. That's our second premise. It's the second reason why they should move to the front of the class. All right, so identify all the propositions, the true false statements, then identify the conclusion, look for the conclusion indicators, if that might help you, then look for all the premises. Premise indicators might be there, they often are, but either way, what you're looking for in this step are the premises that help support the conclusion, the reasons for the conclusion, right? Let's take a look at how we would do this in sort of a longer argument that's more than just one or two sentences. I am a student attending Columbia Basin College, and I believe the state of Washington should have free college tuition because it would only benefit our country and its people. The more educated its people are, the more that can be accomplished, the more it can sustain itself. America needs to be able to academically compete with other countries, and we can't do that if people can't afford to further educate themselves. The cost to attend a university seems daunting to those who sacrifice greatly to pay for it and out of reach to those who cannot afford it. So what are our propositions? Remember, these are the true, false statements that aren't just expressive or descriptive. I am a student attending Columbia Basin College. That's not part of the argument. So we wouldn't mark that as a proposition. I believe that the state of Washington should have free college tuition. It is true, I believe. So that would be a proposition. It is true that it would only benefit our country and its people. That's a proposition. It is true, the more educated its people are, the more that can be accomplished, the more it can sustain itself. That's a proposition. It is true that America needs to be able to academically compete with other countries, and we can't do that if people can't afford to further educate themselves. That's a proposition. It is true that the cost to attend a university seems daunting to those who sacrifice greatly to pay for it and out of reach to those who cannot afford it. proposition. Now, out of all of those propositions, which one seems to be the conclusion? What are they trying to convince us of? They're trying to prove that the state of Washington should have free college tuition. What are their reasons? Well, we have one right after the conclusion. We see the premise indicator because it would only benefit our country and its people. That's one way. That's one support. The more educated its people are, the more that can be accomplished, the more it can sustain itself. That's another one. That's another reason why Washington should have free college tuition. Another reason is America needs to be able to academically compete with other countries, and we can't do that if people can't afford to further educate themselves. And then our final reason is the cost to attend a university seems daunting to those who sacrifice greatly to pay for it and out of reach to those who cannot afford it. So 4 premises, some of these are complex sentences. We could actually break it down into more premises because we've got the more educated its people are, the more that can be accomplished. That's one. And the more educated its people are, the more it can sustain itself. That's actually 2 sort of reasons right there. But because of the way it was written, the sentence structure, it ends up just being one proposition. But there's 2 ideas in there, right? So 4 propositions, 4 premises to support why the state of Washington should have free college tuition. So when I look at this, I can clearly see what she's trying to prove. And then I can see how many supporting ideas that she has. And I can look at each one of them individually and know that I'm not missing anything or not getting the whole picture as I look at each reason. I've sort of categorized them. Okay. Now, a few warnings, a few caveats before we go any further. I had said that there are some premise indicators that are used often, like for, so, because, therefore, and since. Those are great signals to look for, that what comes after is a premise, a reason. But those words function in a variety of ways in the English language, so you have to look at them carefully when spotted. So if you see the word because, you need to look carefully at that statement to decide whether or not it is truly a premise. The word because used in different ways. For example, because the demographics and immigration pattern of the United States is changing, the workforce of today's college graduates will be much different than that of their parents. That's just a statement by itself. If it was part of an argument, would it be a premise? Possibly, but it doesn't have to be. The word because does not automatically mean, oh, that is a supporting idea for a concluding thought. No. Or since the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, the nature of intercultural relationships radically changed for most Americans. Right? Since can also indicate a passage of time, not just a reason. Right? So you do have to be careful when you're looking for those indicators, and not get tripped up and assume that just because you see one, that's automatically a premise. Check it out. Verify. Right? Now, once we have sort of determined the different elements of the argument, right? We know what our propositions are, we know what our premises are, and we know what our conclusion is. Now we have to evaluate those arguments, right? So we're going to look for clarity, credibility, relevance, completeness, and soundness. Okay. Step 1, clarity. Is the argument clear and unambiguous? Right? You have to make sure that you understand it correctly. When you're looking at the argument, when you're creating the argument, you're going to need to do the same thing. Every argument needs to be clear and unambiguous. Look at each premise and look at the conclusion. Are they stated in terms that are clear and understandable? Is any part of the argument unclear? If the meaning of a key term is ambiguous, ask for clarification if possible. For example, we have the argument, immigration is ruining this country. Well, what do we mean by immigration? Are we talking about all immigration? Or specific types of immigration? Illegal immigration? Illegal immigration from one area in particular? That's a big, immigration by itself is a very broad term. And it can make us unclear as to whether or not we should agree with the statement, right? What do you mean by ruining? Ruining what? Right? This country is, there's not just one thing that makes us this country. It's what exactly is being ruined. So if someone were to say, no, I mean all immigration. So let's say you just heard that statement, immigration is ruining this country. And you're like, maybe. Like, I might agree with that. I'd like to hear more though. I need some clarification on what you mean by this. Do you mean all immigration? Even legal immigration? And the person says, yeah, I mean all immigration. Then you could be like, oh, I don't really have a problem with legal immigration. So I can't really agree with your statement. I can't agree with that conclusion. Do you see what I mean? You have to ask for clarification, because what if you're not asking for clarification, you may be agreeing to something that you don't really agree with, or vice versa, right? So when you're dealing with broad terms or ambiguous terms, ask for clarification so that you can truly evaluate the argument. Are the premises supported by evidence? So our premises are the reasons we are giving for the conclusion. But the premises have to be credible, right? They have to be based on credible evidence. And that's where our research comes in, right? Doing that wide array of research and keeping an open mind. That's how we create strong premises. So just because you've identified them in someone else's argument doesn't mean they're good, right? You then have to ask, are these premises, are these reasons relevant? Are they strong? Do they make sense? Are they logical? Are they supported? Are the premises relevant to the conclusion, right? They should provide relevant information. Going back to the immigration example, let's say that research showed that immigrants are actually not a financial burden to the U.S. Well, that information would not be relevant to the conclusion. It would be relevant to the counter argument. So you wouldn't want to, if you have to make sure that every premise is relevant to the conclusion, that it's credible, and that it actually helps support the conclusion, that it doesn't go into something else entirely, or that it doesn't accidentally support the counter argument. Are there any unstated premises and conclusions? Premises can be omitted for several reasons. Like, part of the reason for supporting the conclusion, some of them might get left out. There's different reasons for this. Maybe we're not even aware of a particular bit of key information that's related to this conclusion. So that information got left out. We may overlook important information, or we may reject premises that don't support our worldview, so we didn't include them in our argument. We talked about this before, confirmation bias. Sometimes the premise, though, is left out simply because it's quite obvious and doesn't really need to be stated. So, for example, we have federal funding for education should be allocated on the basis of the size of the state. Therefore, Texas should get a larger share of federal money than Rhode Island. Well, we made a jump there from this should be statement to our conclusion. How did we get from A to C? Well, we skipped over B, but it's because we assumed our readers would already know that Texas is bigger than Rhode Island, right? We didn't need to say it. Sometimes the premise is left out because it's controversial or it's based on an unfounded assumption. So here, or that it would weaken the argument in some way, right? Really look at the line of reasoning, right? The progression of premises to the conclusion. Does it step along one step after another in a way where everything is connected and you can see how we got from thought A to thought D? Or was B or C left out? And if B or C was left out, ask why. Ask yourself why. If there are any unstated premises, if any step along this line of reasoning got left out, what's the reason? Was there a good reason for it? Or what does that mean that the argument is actually weaker than it appears because they left out something that would weaken the argument, right? All right. Are the premises true and do they support the conclusion? That's the other thing is, not just looking at the line of reasoning, but looking at each premise and determining if it's factually true, right? Constructing an argument. I would like to get into this for just a moment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I'm more concerned with everyone fully learning how to recognize and analyze an argument. This class is not necessarily about writing research papers of magnitude where you are, it could be, I could have gone that way, but I didn't. It's really more about self-exploration and learning critical thinking skills. And I don't think you always have to know the formal way of constructing an argument, but you might need to for other classes. So here's what you need to do if you are constructing an argument, or maybe even in your personal life at some point. State the issue, develop a list of premises. Those are your reasons. Eliminate weak or irrelevant premises. Establish a conclusion. Then organize your argument. Try out your argument on others. Revise your argument, and then put it into action, right? You can go through these slides in a little more detail if you want. I would say, stating the issue, make sure that, again, you realize that an issue is often a very broad, ill-defined, complex thing, and you want to state your issue as clearly and open-mindedly as possible. Developing your list of premises, those are your reasons. Your main premises will probably become your main points. Develop a list of premises, all of your reasons, and then eliminate weak or ineffective ones. I think that, or irrelevant. I think this is the stuff that a lot of people gloss over when they are writing an argumentative paper is, you come up with all of these reasons, all of these main ideas, and you don't really go back and look and think, well, I don't know. That one's not as strong. Or this is interesting, but does it really apply to this specific issue, this specific focus that I've taken? So don't skip step 3. Then establish your conclusion, right? And make sure you're not drawing your conclusion too soon. But this is a good slide here to pay attention to. Organizing your argument, So in your introductory paragraph, you're going to identify the issue, present your premises next. If possible, you want to put your main premises in your thesis statement, your main points, right? Each main point is going to have several sub-points when you actually start talking about them in the body of the essay, but your main points, your overall big main points, you should try to have them be, listed in your thesis statement. And then, each premise should have at least one paragraph in the body of the essay, right? Main points. More than likely, though, each main point is going to require more than one paragraph to fully develop. And then you want to present and address your counter argument. If you're really doing an argumentative paper, you have to address the opposition, people whose perspectives differ from the one you are presenting in the essay. Then your conclusion and summary, and then of course any references, right? So you can come back to these slides if you want to take a closer look at how to construct an argument in essay form. Even in like oral form debate, you'd still want to use this same general construction, same general structure. But like I said, I wanted to spend the majority of this lesson looking at recognizing and analyzing arguments, because I think that's where we spend most of our time in our lives, is recognizing and analyzing. We construct our own, for sure, and especially in our personal lives. But I think once you get really good at recognizing and analyzing arguments, being able to look at the different parts, the different elements of someone else's argument, looking at those propositions, what are the premises? What is the conclusion? Are the premises well supported by credible research, right? It kind of automatically starts to translate into your own argument construction. Once, the skills that you're applying to recognize and analyze someone else's argument, you automatically start to employ more of those skills when you are presenting your own argument, right? All right. So, take some time to review Chapter 6, right? Again, I hit the highlights here, but the chapter is going to give a little more detail, and really the chapter is going to give you more examples. I think that's really where the book is quite useful, is providing you with more examples, and especially like in the little text boxes and the highlights and the thinking outside the box areas in each chapter. They give you additional perspectives or an additional examples and ideas. So definitely go through Chapter 6. At the end of Chapter 6, we have a critical thinking issue, which is perspectives on same-sex marriage. This is not the critical thinking issue that we will be covering in this week's assignment. So I highly encourage you to go ahead and read that critical thinking issue section there at the end of Chapter 6. We've got some Supreme Court stuff going on again, meaning like the opinions handed down from the justices. And it's super, super interesting, I think anyway, looking at the construction of the arguments, looking at the premises and the conclusion and how each one establishes their perspective. So I highly encourage you to give that critical thinking issue a look, especially since we're not going to be covering it in the assignment this week. Okay. Now, if you have any questions or concerns while you're going through Chapter 6, or when you're working on any of the assignment questions that will go along with Chapter 6, definitely reach out and I will help you as much as I can. Otherwise, you're free to go ahead and move on.